I'm Rebecca, 26, and at 2 a.m. last Tuesday, I found my disabled sister Hannah collapsed on my doorstep in the middle of a snowstorm, barely breathing and hypothermic, after our parents abandoned her at a gas station 20 miles away. As I called 911, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother: "Don't save that cripple, she's been nothing but a burden and it's time to let nature take its course." What she didn't know was that I'd been secretly documenting their abuse of Hannah for months, and her cruel message just became the evidence that would destroy their lives and land them in prison for attempted murder. Think you can predict how far family cruelty can go before justice intervenes? Hit that like button if you believe protecting vulnerable family members is worth any cost. Subscribe for more shocking family abuse exposure stories. And let's dive into how sometimes saving one life means destroying the people who tried to end it. Growing up in the Peterson household meant understanding exactly where you stood in the family hierarchy. I was the golden child, athletic, academically gifted, and everything my parents David and Susan Peterson dreamed their daughter would become. Hannah, my younger sister with cerebral palsy, represented everything they wished had never happened to their perfect family. From birth, Hannah's condition required constant medical attention, specialized equipment, and accommodations that my parents viewed as expensive obstacles to their comfortable lifestyle. While other families might have adapted their expectations and found joy in Hannah's unique strengths, mine simply treated her existence as a cosmic punishment they were forced to endure. "Rebecca has such unlimited potential," my mother would announce to dinner guests, while Hannah sat quietly in her wheelchair nearby. "She's going to medical school, and will probably specialize in something prestigious like neurosurgery or cardiology. We are so proud of how she's exceeded every expectation we had." The contrast was deliberate and cruel. While my achievements were celebrated as evidence of superior parenting and genetic blessing, Hannah's struggles were treated as shameful family secrets that needed to be hidden from public view. Hannah requires so much special attention that it's affected our ability to provide Rebecca with all the opportunities she deserves, my father would explain to relatives, speaking about Hannah as if she couldn't understand the conversation happening around her. "We've had to sacrifice vacations, private lessons, and educational programs because Hannah's medical needs consume so much of our resources." Every family financial discussion centered around the burden of Hannah's care and how much money could have been saved or invested differently if she didn't require constant medical supervision. Physical therapy appointments, adaptive equipment, and accessible transportation were treated as unwelcome expenses rather than necessary support for their daughter's well-being. The emotional neglect was even more devastating than the financial resentment. Family photos were arranged to minimize Hannah's wheelchair visibility. Holiday celebrations were planned around activities where her limitations wouldn't be embarrassing to extended family. Vacation destinations were chosen based on whether Hannah could be easily excluded from family activities. "We want to take a family ski trip this year," my parents would announce, knowing perfectly well that Hannah couldn't participate in skiing activities. "Rebecca will love learning to ski, and it'll be nice to have a vacation that isn't limited by accessibility requirements." Hannah would listen to these conversations with the quiet resignation of someone who'd learned that her family viewed her presence as a restriction on their happiness rather than something to be celebrated and included. School events were another source of systematic exclusion. If Hannah's attendance required special arrangements or accessibility accommodations, she simply wasn't included in family participation. Parent-teacher conferences focused exclusively on my academic achievements, while Hannah's progress reports were filed away without discussion or recognition. "Rebecca is the type of student who makes teaching worthwhile," my teachers would tell my parents during conferences. "She's destined for great things, and will probably receive full academic scholarships to top universities." Meanwhile, Hannah's teachers would provide progress reports about her artistic talents, her kindness toward classmates, and her remarkable resilience in overcoming daily challenges. These reports were acknowledged with polite nods, but never celebrated or discussed as evidence of Hannah's value and potential. The systematic exclusion extended to extended family relationships. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins received regular updates about my academic achievements, athletic accomplishments, and future plans, while Hannah's existence was barely mentioned in family communications. Rebecca is captain of the debate team and valedictorian of her class, my mother would share during family phone calls. We are so excited about her college prospects and the full scholarships she's been offered. Hannah's artwork, her volunteer work with younger disabled children, and her remarkable emotional intelligence were never mentioned as sources of family pride or evidence of her contributions to our household and community. But the most damaging aspect of their treatment was the constant verbal reminders that Hannah was unwanted and unworthy of the resources required to keep her healthy and safe. These reminders became more frequent and more vicious as Hannah entered her teenage years and my parents began discussing long-term care solutions for when she became a legal adult. We can't continue providing full-time care indefinitely, my father would say during family meetings where Hannah was present but treated as if her opinion about her own future was irrelevant. Hannah will never be able to live independently or contribute financially to her own support. We need to start researching residential facilities that can provide professional supervision. The discussions about residential facilities were actually conversations about institutional placement, warehousing Hannah in state-run facilities, where she could be forgotten and ignored while my parents focused on supporting my college education and career development. Once Rebecca is established in medical school, we'll have more flexibility to explore long-term care options that would allow Hannah to receive professional attention while giving us the freedom to travel and enjoy our retirement years, my mother would explain, as if abandoning Hannah was a reasonable reward for successfully raising one acceptable child. What they didn't realize was that their acceptable child had been listening to every cruel conversation, documenting every instance of neglect, and preparing evidence that would eventually destroy their comfortable lives and expose them as the abusers they'd always been. By the time I started college, the mask of reluctant caregiving had completely fallen away, revealing parents whose resentment toward Hannah had evolved into active cruelty that bordered on systematic torture disguised as tough love discipline. The abuse escalated dramatically once I was no longer present to witness their daily treatment of Hannah. Phone calls from home revealed increasing isolation, food restrictions, and medical neglect that transformed their house from an uncomfortable environment into a dangerous prison. Rebecca, they locked me in my room for 2 days because I accidentally dropped a glass while trying to get water, Hannah whispered during one late-night call, clearly afraid of being overheard. They said clumsy people need to learn consequences for being careless with other people's property. The punishment was cruel and disproportionate, but it was also a pattern. Every minor accident or struggle related to Hannah's disability was treated as deliberate misbehavior that required increasingly harsh corrections. They are saying I eat too much food and cost too much money to feed properly, Hannah reported during another call, her voice weak with hunger and exhaustion. They've started rationing my meals and telling me that disabled people should be grateful for whatever food they receive instead of expecting to eat as much as normal people. The deliberate malnutrition was criminal abuse disguised as budget consciousness. I immediately started documenting every conversation, secretly recording Hannah's reports while building evidence of systematic neglect that was escalating toward life-threatening conditions. Mom told me I should have died during my birth complications, Hannah cried during one particularly devastating call. She said the family would have been better off if I hadn't survived, and she wishes she could go back and make different decisions about my medical treatment. I began recording our phone conversations with Hannah's permission, knowing that her reports of emotional abuse would be difficult to prove without documentation. The recordings captured hours of heartbreaking testimony about parents who'd stopped pretending to love their disabled daughter. During winter break, I returned home to find Hannah visibly malnourished, unwashed, and showing signs of depression that indicated months of psychological torture. Our parents had stopped providing basic care while maintaining the appearance of reluctant, but dutiful caregiving to outside observers. Hannah, when was the last time someone helped you shower or do laundry? I asked privately when our parents were out of the house. They say I'm old enough to figure out how to take care of myself, she replied, clearly ashamed about admitting the extent of their neglect. They told me that disabled adults who can't manage personal hygiene independently don't deserve help from family members who have their own lives to live. The systematic neglect was designed to break Hannah's spirit and convince her that she was too burdensome to deserve basic human care and dignity. I spent the week helping Hannah with personal care while secretly photographing evidence of neglect and malnutrition. But the most chilling discovery was their internet search history, which revealed months of research into legal ways to stop caring for disabled adult children. They'd been reading forums and articles about families who'd let nature take its course with disabled relatives by withdrawing support and allowing natural consequences to determine survival. Sometimes disabled people are better off if families stop interfering with natural selection, my mother had printed out from an online article. Continuing to provide support for people who can't survive independently might be preventing them from finding their own solutions or accepting their limitations. The language was coded, but the intent was clear. They were researching ways to abandon Hannah without legal liability for her death. Their conversations during my winter break confirmed that abandonment was being seriously planned as a solution to their Hannah problem. We can't continue living like this indefinitely, my father said during a conversation he didn't realize I was recording. Hannah is never going to be independent, never going to contribute financially, and never going to stop being a drain on our resources and emotional energy. What are you suggesting? My mother asked, though her tone indicated she knew exactly what solution he was proposing. There are ways to transition disabled adult children toward independence that don't require ongoing family support, he replied carefully. Programs and services that handle people like Hannah so families can focus on their own lives and futures. The programs and services they were discussing weren't legitimate disability services with oversight and professional care standards. They were researching ways to abandon Hannah in situations where survival would be unlikely, allowing them to claim they'd provided opportunities for independence while ensuring that natural consequences would eliminate their burden permanently. We could drive her to a city where there are social services available, my mother suggested during another recorded conversation. Give her some money and information about programs for disabled people, then let her figure out how to access the help she needs. But what if she can't access those services or survive on her own? I asked when I finally confronted them about their plans. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. They were counting on Hannah's inability to survive abandonment, using her death to solve their caregiving problem, while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. That's when I contacted law enforcement and social services about the evidence I'd been gathering, learning that I had documentation of criminal neglect, emotional abuse, and conspiracy to commit harm against a disabled person. Keep documenting everything, Detective Rodriguez advised after reviewing my recordings and photographs. If they attempt to abandon her or escalate to immediate physical harm, call 911 immediately and have all your evidence ready to present to emergency responders. The escalation I'd been dreading came 3 weeks later, during the coldest weather of the year, when Hannah's phone calls stopped completely and my parents' solution to their burden was finally implemented under conditions designed to ensure it would be fatal. The final phase of my parents' plan to eliminate Hannah happened on January 15, during a blizzard that made survival nearly impossible for anyone without adequate shelter and transportation. They'd chosen the conditions deliberately, ensuring that Hannah's chances of surviving their abandonment would be virtually zero. I received the first warning that something was wrong when my family tracking app showed my parents' car leaving the house at 11:47 p.m., heading toward the interstate during the worst snowstorm of the year. Hannah had no phone. They'd confiscated it weeks earlier as part of her systematic isolation, so she had no way to contact me or call for emergency help. The route they were taking led to cities over an hour away from our small town, places where Hannah would have no local connections, no familiar landmarks, and no resources for survival during dangerous weather conditions. The timing and destination made their intentions undeniably clear. I immediately got in my car and began following their route, using the tracking app to monitor their progress while battling dangerous driving conditions and visibility that made travel nearly suicidal. If my parents had abandoned Hannah somewhere along this route, exposure and hypothermia could be fatal within hours. Their car stopped at a 24-hour gas station about 45 minutes from home, far enough away that Hannah couldn't return even if she had transportation, but close enough that my parents could claim they provided access to services and shelter. When I arrived at the gas station, the overnight clerk confirmed that a couple had dropped off a young woman in a wheelchair about an hour earlier, claiming she was meeting friends who would pick her up shortly. They left her outside by the gas pumps during the worst part of the storm, the clerk explained. I asked if she needed to come inside to get warm, but she said her ride would be there soon. That was over 2 hours ago, and nobody's come for her. The security camera footage was heartbreaking. Hannah sitting alone in her wheelchair during a blizzard, clearly struggling with visibility and dangerous conditions while waiting for help that wasn't coming. After about an hour, the footage showed her leaving the gas station property, pushing her wheelchair through snow-covered streets in search of shelter or assistance. I spent 4 hours driving through the storm, checking every possible location where Hannah might have sought help: hospitals, police stations, all-night restaurants, anywhere she might have been able to get inside and access assistance. The search felt hopeless in weather conditions that were challenging even for people with cars and winter clothing. Hannah was traveling in a wheelchair, wearing inadequate clothing for extreme weather, with no money, no phone, and no local knowledge to guide her toward safety. Finally, at 2:47 a.m., I found her collapsed in my apartment driveway, nearly 20 miles from where my parents had abandoned her. She'd somehow navigated through dangerous conditions, using street signs and landmarks to find the only safe place she could remember, my home. Hannah was unconscious when I discovered her, her wheelchair overturned in the snow, and her body showing clear signs of severe hypothermia. Her breathing was shallow, her skin was dangerously cold, and she'd clearly been unconscious for some time before I found her. I called 911 while covering her with blankets and attempting to move her inside my apartment building. The paramedics arrived within minutes, beginning emergency treatment for hypothermia and exposure while preparing to transport her to the regional trauma center. How long was she outside? The lead paramedic asked while they stabilized her condition. Possibly 5 hours, I replied, watching them work to prevent organ failure and cardiac complications from prolonged exposure. My parents abandoned her at a gas station during the blizzard, and she made it here on her own. Someone abandoned a disabled person in this weather. The paramedic's voice carried disbelief and horror. That's attempted murder. You need to call police immediately. As the ambulance transported Hannah to emergency care, my phone buzzed with a text message that would become the final piece of evidence needed to ensure my parents' conviction for attempted homicide. The message from my mother read, "Don't save that cripple, she's been nothing but a burden and it's time to let nature take its course. We gave her a chance to become independent, and if she can't survive on her own, that's natural selection, not our fault." The casual cruelty and explicit statement of intent to cause Hannah's death was more damning than anything I could have imagined. My parents had just provided written confession of their deliberate plan to kill Hannah through abandonment and exposure. I immediately forwarded the message to Detective Rodriguez, along with months of recordings, photographs, and documentation of systematic abuse that had culminated in attempted murder disguised as tough love independence training. "This is a clear case of attempted homicide," Detective Rodriguez told me when I called to report Hannah's condition and my mother's text message. "They deliberately abandoned a disabled person in life-threatening conditions with expressed intent to cause her death. We'll have arrest warrants issued within hours. While Hannah fought for her life in intensive care, my parents returned home expecting to find their problem permanently solved through exposure and hypothermia. Instead, they found police cars in their driveway and arrest warrants for attempted murder, criminal neglect, and conspiracy to commit harm against a disabled person. Their plan to eliminate Hannah through natural consequences had failed spectacularly, and now they were facing criminal consequences that would destroy their comfortable lives while Hannah began the long journey toward healing and justice. The 72 hours following Hannah's rescue were a desperate battle between medical professionals working to save her life and law enforcement building the case that would ensure our parents faced appropriate consequences for their calculated attempt at murder. Hannah's treatment for severe hypothermia required intensive care monitoring to prevent cardiac arrhythmias, organ failure, and neurological complications that could result from prolonged exposure to life-threatening conditions. The medical team was amazed that she'd survived 5 hours in sub-zero weather while pushing herself through snow-covered streets in a wheelchair. "Your sister's survival is extraordinary," Dr. Patricia Chen explained while reviewing Hannah's treatment progress. Hypothermia combined with her underlying medical condition should have been fatal. Her determination to reach safety and her physical resilience literally saved her life. But Hannah's physical recovery was complicated by the psychological trauma of realizing that her parents had deliberately attempted to kill her by abandoning her during the worst storm of the year. The betrayal by people who were supposed to protect her had left emotional wounds that would require extensive therapy and support. "I knew they didn't love me," she whispered during one of her first conscious conversations, "but I never thought they actually wanted me dead. When they drove away and left me at that gas station, I understood that this wasn't about teaching me independence, they wanted me to disappear." The criminal investigation moved swiftly once prosecutors reviewed the overwhelming evidence of premeditated attempted murder. The recordings of my parents discussing Hannah as a burden who should die, the photographs documenting systematic neglect and abuse, and most damning of all, my mother's text message expressing hope that I wouldn't save that cripple, created an undeniable case of intent to kill. This represents one of the most calculated cases of attempted murder disguised as family discipline that our office has prosecuted, announced District Attorney Jennifer Martinez during a press conference about the charges. The defendants systematically abused their disabled daughter for years before escalating to deliberate abandonment in conditions designed to cause her death. My parents' initial response was to claim that their actions had been misunderstood and that they'd been attempting to motivate Hannah toward independence rather than harm her. Their attorney argued that the abandonment was tough love, designed to encourage self-sufficiency rather than attempted murder. But the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The months of recorded conversations about wanting Hannah to die, the documented pattern of medical neglect and deliberate malnutrition, and the text message explicitly hoping she wouldn't survive made their true intentions impossible to deny or explain away. The defendants' own words provide incontrovertible evidence of their intent to cause the victim's death through abandonment in life-threatening weather conditions, Prosecutor Robert Kim argued during the preliminary hearing. This wasn't parenting gone wrong, this was premeditated attempted murder of a disabled family member they viewed as inconvenient. The community reaction was immediate and decisive. My parents were fired from their jobs when employers learned about the criminal charges, their social circle abandoned them completely, and they became pariahs in a town where everyone knew our family and was horrified by the revelations about their treatment of Hannah. "We had no idea what David and Susan were doing to Hannah behind closed doors," said Mrs. Anderson, our neighbor for over 15 years, during a local news interview. "They always complained about Hannah being difficult and expensive, but we never imagined they were systematically abusing her or planning to kill her." The media coverage brought attention to the broader issue of family abuse against disabled individuals, with disability rights organizations using our case to highlight how disabled family members can be systematically dehumanized and abused by people who should be their greatest protectors. Hannah Peterson's survival and her sister's courage in documenting abuse have exposed the reality that disabled individuals face from family members who view them as burdens rather than beloved relatives deserving protection and support, said Margaret Williams, director of our state's Disability Rights Coalition. But the most powerful moment came when Hannah was strong enough to provide her victim impact statement to prosecutors, detailing years of abuse that had escalated to attempted murder by parents who'd convinced themselves that her death would be a mercy rather than a crime. They told me for years that I was worthless, a burden, and better off dead, Hannah told prosecutor Martinez during her recorded statement. They tried to kill me by abandoning me in a blizzard because they thought my life wasn't worth the inconvenience of caring for me. But I survived because people like my sister understand that every life has value, regardless of disability or dependency. The legal proceedings moved quickly toward plea negotiations, with both parents ultimately accepting guilt to attempted murder charges in exchange for substantial prison sentences, rather than risking longer terms if convicted at trial. David Peterson is sentenced to 15 years in state prison, announced Judge Robert Garcia during the sentencing hearing. Susan Peterson is sentenced to 12 years in state prison. Both defendants will pay full restitution for medical expenses and are permanently prohibited from any contact with the victim. The sentences ensured that Hannah would be safe from further abuse while she rebuilt her life, but the real victory was Hannah's survival and the knowledge that their attempt to eliminate her had failed completely while destroying their own lives in the process. Justice had been served, but the more important work of helping Hannah heal and thrive was just beginning. 8 months after her near-death experience, Hannah had not only recovered physically from the hypothermia and exposure, but had begun to flourish in ways that revealed everything our parents had gotten wrong about disability, potential, and human worth. Living with me had provided Hannah with the first stable, supportive environment she'd experienced since childhood. With proper nutrition, medical care, and emotional support, her health and strength had improved dramatically, while access to resources our parents had denied revealed capabilities they'd never bothered to recognize or develop. Hannah's progress has been remarkable, said Dr. Sarah Kim, her new physician, during one of our regular appointments. Her previous medical records indicate systematic neglect of her care needs. With proper attention and support, many of the complications attributed to her cerebral palsy were actually consequences of malnutrition and medical neglect rather than inherent limitations. The physical therapy Hannah was receiving had improved her mobility and independence significantly. The occupational therapy was teaching her adaptive techniques for daily tasks that our parents had claimed she'd never master. Most importantly, the psychological counseling was helping her overcome years of emotional abuse while building confidence in her own worth and potential. But the most dramatic transformation was Hannah's emergence as an artist and advocate whose work was gaining recognition far beyond our local community. With access to proper art supplies and encouragement rather than criticism, her paintings and poetry were being featured in galleries and publications focused on disability rights and trauma recovery. Hannah's artwork captures universal themes of survival and resilience that resonate with anyone who's overcome systematic oppression, said Maria Rodriguez, director of the Regional Arts Council, where Hannah had become a featured artist. Her pieces about finding strength after family betrayal are moving audiences to tears while inspiring conversations about the value of every human life. The recognition Hannah was receiving for her creative work was providing exactly the sense of purpose and accomplishment our parents had insisted she'd never achieve. She was contributing to important cultural conversations about disability rights, family abuse, and the power of artistic expression to heal and educate. But perhaps the most meaningful development was Hannah's role as a speaker and advocate for other disabled individuals facing family abuse or neglect. Her testimony about surviving attempted murder by parents had inspired other abuse victims to report their situations and seek help from authorities and social services. I receive emails and letters from disabled people across the country who are dealing with families that view them as burdens, Hannah told me during one of our evening conversations. My story gives them hope that survival is possible and that abuse doesn't determine their worth or potential for meaningful lives. The speaking engagements were generating income that allowed Hannah to contribute financially to our household while building independence that our parents had claimed was impossible. She was earning money through art sales, speaking fees, and freelance writing, demonstrating exactly the self-sufficiency they'd used to justify their abuse. "Rebecca, I want to pay half of our rent and grocery expenses," Hannah announced during one of our monthly budget discussions. "My income from speaking and art sales is increasing steadily, and I want our living arrangement to be a true partnership rather than me depending on your generosity." The conversation was particularly meaningful because it addressed the independence issues our parents had used to rationalize their cruelty. Hannah was achieving financial self-sufficiency in ways that honored her capabilities while building on her experiences rather than ignoring her limitations. But the most unexpected development was the response from extended family members who'd been horrified to learn about our parents' abuse and were now working to support Hannah's recovery and success. "Hannah, we owe you a profound apology for not recognizing the abuse you were suffering," our Aunt Carol said during a family gathering where relatives were meeting Hannah as an independent adult for the first time. "We should have been more observant and protective when you needed support most." The family members who'd previously avoided Hannah due to our parents' complaints about her being difficult and expensive were now recognizing her as an accomplished artist, effective advocate, and remarkable survivor whose experiences had given her wisdom they respected and admired. "I had no idea Hannah was so talented and articulate," said our cousin Mark, who'd rarely interacted with Hannah during family events when our parents were controlling the narrative about her capabilities. "David and Susan portrayed her so negatively that we never got to know who she really was beneath their constant criticism and resentment." The revelation that Hannah's isolation had been orchestrated by our parents rather than caused by her own limitations was helping extended family understand how abuse victims can be systematically cut off from support networks by their abusers. Family abuse often involves isolating victims from people who might recognize the abuse and intervene, Hannah explained during one of her presentations about recognizing and preventing disability abuse. "My parents convinced relatives that I was difficult and ungrateful so that any complaints I might make would be dismissed as typical behavior rather than cries for help." Her educational work was helping train social workers, medical professionals, and community members to recognize subtle signs of disability abuse before it escalated to life-threatening situations like abandonment or medical neglect. Most importantly, Hannah was developing meaningful relationships with people who valued her intelligence, creativity, and character while providing the social connections our parents had systematically prevented through years of isolation and exclusion. "Hannah, your friendship has enriched my life immeasurably," said Jennifer Walsh, a fellow advocate who'd become one of Hannah's closest friends. "Your perspective on overcoming adversity and finding purpose through service has influenced my own approach to advocacy work and personal growth." The friendships Hannah was building proved that our parents' claims about her being unlovable and unsuitable for normal relationships had been projections of their own limitations rather than accurate assessments of Hannah's social potential. But the most personally meaningful development was Hannah's romantic relationship with Michael Chen, a disability rights attorney who'd been impressed by her speaking and advocacy work before asking her out after one of her conference presentations. "Michael treats me like any other accomplished professional he might be interested in dating," Hannah told me excitedly after their relationship became serious. "He's interested in my work, my goals, my ideas about policy and social change. My disability is part of who I am, but it's not the defining characteristic of how he sees me or our potential together." The relationship that developed between Hannah and Michael proved everything our parents had been wrong about regarding Hannah's capacity for love, partnership, and building a shared future with someone who appreciated her completely. 18 months after that terrifying night, when I found Hannah collapsed in my driveway, I'm sitting in the front row at her wedding to Michael, watching my sister marry a man who sees her exactly as she deserves to be seen, as a brilliant, accomplished woman whose disability is just one aspect of a complex person worthy of love and partnership. The ceremony was held at the art gallery, where Hannah's latest exhibition was being displayed, surrounded by paintings that chronicled her journey from abuse victim to survivor to advocate to beloved partner. The guests included disability rights attorneys, fellow artists, abuse survivors, and family members who'd learned to appreciate Hannah for who she truly was rather than who our parents had claimed she could never become. Hannah and Michael's relationship represents everything beautiful about finding someone who loves you completely, said Dr. Patricia Chen, Hannah's physician, who'd become a close friend during Hannah's recovery process. Their partnership demonstrates that disability doesn't limit capacity for deep love and mutual support. It often enhances appreciation for the person who accepts and celebrates all aspects of who you are. The wedding reception became an informal celebration of survival, resilience, and the power of chosen family to heal wounds inflicted by biological relatives who'd failed in their most basic obligations of love and protection. "Rebecca, you saved my life by refusing to accept our parents' definition of my worth," Hannah said during her maid of honor speech. "But more importantly, you showed me that real family is created through love and loyalty rather than determined by genetics and obligation." The transformation in Hannah's life had been complete and inspiring. She'd gone from being an isolated abuse victim our parents tried to murder to becoming a successful artist, effective advocate, beloved wife, and woman whose survival story was inspiring disabled people nationwide to seek help and build meaningful lives despite family rejection. Hannah's case led to legislative changes that have literally saved lives, said State Representative Maria Rodriguez, who'd sponsored the disability protection laws inspired by Hannah's story. The reporting requirements and emergency services established after her experience have helped dozens of disabled individuals escape abusive families and access resources for independent living. The Hannah Peterson Protection Act had created mandatory reporting systems for suspected disability abuse, emergency services for disabled individuals fleeing family violence, and funding for transitional housing programs that supported movement from abusive homes to safe, autonomous living situations. But the most satisfying aspect of justice wasn't legislative, it was personal. Our parents had now served over 2 years of their prison sentences, and their attempts to contact Hannah through letters and third parties were being blocked by restraining orders that would remain in effect permanently. "I don't feel hatred toward them anymore," Hannah told me during one of our conversations about forgiveness and healing. "I feel pity for people whose capacity for love was so limited that they tried to destroy someone rather than learning to appreciate different kinds of strength and contribution." Their attempt to eliminate Hannah as a burden had failed spectacularly while Hannah built exactly the life they'd claimed she could never achieve. She was financially independent through her art and advocacy work, happily married to someone who adored her, and contributing meaningfully to society through work that protected other vulnerable individuals. "Our parents spent years telling me I'd never amount to anything, never find love, never be able to support myself," Hannah reflected during a quiet moment at her wedding reception. "Every aspect of my current life proves how wrong they were about my potential and worth." The contrast between Hannah's success and our parents' destruction was complete. While Hannah was celebrating her wedding surrounded by people who loved and respected her, our parents were serving prison sentences in facilities where their crimes against a disabled family member had made them targets of other inmates who despised child and disability abusers. My own life had been transformed by Hannah's presence and recovery. Witnessing her resilience and watching her build a meaningful life despite systematic abuse had inspired me to change careers from marketing to social work, specializing in disability advocacy and family abuse prevention. Rebecca's decision to document abuse and protect her sister demonstrates that sometimes the most important work is protecting people who can't protect themselves from family members, who should be their greatest allies, said my supervisor at the disability rights organization where I now worked. The experience had taught me that love is demonstrated through actions rather than words, and that real family bonds are strengthened by supporting each other through difficulties rather than abandoning family members when caring becomes challenging. Hannah and Michael's honeymoon plans included speaking engagements at disability rights conferences, where Hannah would share her story of survival and recovery while educating audiences about recognizing and preventing family abuse against disabled individuals. "I want my experience to prevent other disabled people from suffering what our parents put me through," Hannah told me as she prepared for her advocacy work. "If sharing my story helps even one person escape abuse or recognize their own worth, then all the pain will have contributed to something positive and meaningful." The most profound realization from our family's story was understanding that the people who love you will fight for your survival and celebrate your success, while those who don't love you will find excuses for abandoning you when support becomes inconvenient. Our parents had failed the most fundamental test of parenthood, protecting their child rather than becoming the source of harm. Their cruelty had revealed their own moral bankruptcy, while demonstrating Hannah's incredible strength and worth. As Hannah and Michael drove away from their wedding reception toward their new life together, I reflected on how completely justice had been served. The burden our parents had tried to eliminate through abandonment and exposure had become a successful advocate, accomplished artist, and beloved wife whose survival had led to legal protections for other vulnerable individuals. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply refusing to be destroyed by people who underestimate your strength and worth. 3 years later, I'm standing in a packed auditorium at our state capitol, watching Hannah deliver the keynote address at the first annual conference on disability rights and family abuse prevention, an event that exists because her survival exposed a crisis that legislators and advocates could no longer ignore. 3 years ago, my parents abandoned me in a blizzard because they believed my life wasn't worth the inconvenience of providing care, Hannah tells the audience of social workers, attorneys, medical professionals, and disability advocates. Their attempt to kill me failed, but their failure became the catalyst for systemic changes that have protected countless other disabled individuals from family violence. The standing ovation that follows lasts nearly 5 minutes, with audience members who'd been moved to tears by Hannah's story of survival and transformation. Her presentation had detailed not just her personal experience, but the legislative changes, policy reforms, and cultural shifts that had resulted from exposing her parents' systematic abuse. The Hannah Peterson Protection Act has led to 347 reports of suspected disability abuse, resulting in 89 criminal prosecutions, and the removal of 156 disabled individuals from dangerous family situations, announced Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the state's Director of Disability Services, during her introduction of Hannah's speech. The statistics represented real lives saved through mandatory reporting requirements, emergency services, and transitional housing programs that hadn't existed before Hannah's case forced legislators to confront the reality of family violence against disabled individuals. But the most meaningful impact was personal rather than statistical. Hannah's work as an advocate, artist, and speaker had created a network of survivors who'd found hope and direction through her example of recovery and resistance. "Hannah, your story gave me the courage to report my family's abuse and rebuild my life," said Marcus Williams, a young man with autism who'd driven 8 hours to attend the conference. "Knowing that someone survived what you survived and built the life you've built convinced me that escape and recovery were possible." The advocacy work Hannah had developed was now her full-time career, with speaking engagements, consulting contracts, and artistic commissions providing financial independence that exceeded anything our parents had ever achieved through their professional careers. Hannah and Michael's marriage had continued to flourish, with their partnership becoming a model of mutual support and shared purpose that inspired other couples where one or both partners had disabilities. They'd purchased their first home together, a fully accessible house with an art studio for Hannah and a law library for Michael, using income from their respective successful careers. Hannah's artistic work has evolved beyond personal trauma recovery to explore broader themes of social justice and human dignity, said Professor Robert Kim from the university's art department, where Hannah's paintings were being studied as examples of disability art that transcended personal narrative to address universal human experiences. Her latest exhibition, titled Beyond Survival, Art as Advocacy, was touring nationally and generating critical acclaim for its powerful visual exploration of resilience, justice, and the transformation of trauma into social change. But the most unexpected development was the response from our extended family, who'd not only apologized for their failure to recognize Hannah's abuse, but had become active supporters of her advocacy work and disability rights causes. Hannah's courage in exposing abuse and building a meaningful life despite systematic cruelty has educated our entire extended family about disability rights and the importance of protecting vulnerable family members, said our Aunt Carol, who now volunteered with the disability rights organization Hannah had helped establish. The family members who'd once avoided Hannah due to our parents' negative portrayal were now among her most dedicated supporters, regularly attending her speaking events and contributing both financially and personally to her advocacy work. Most satisfying was learning about our parents' current situation. They were now in their 4th year of prison sentences, with parole possibilities still years away. Their attempts to portray themselves as misunderstood caregivers had been completely rejected by parole boards, who'd reviewed the extensive evidence of systematic abuse and attempted murder. David and Susan Peterson represent exactly the kind of family abusers our system is designed to identify and prosecute, said Detective Rodriguez, who'd investigated Hannah's case and testified at their sentencing. Their systematic abuse escalated to attempted murder, and their sentences reflect the seriousness of crimes against vulnerable family members. The prison reports we occasionally received indicated that our parents were struggling with the social consequences of their crimes. Inmates who'd learned about their abandonment of a disabled daughter had made their lives difficult and isolated within the prison system, where crimes against children and disabled individuals were viewed with particular contempt. Meanwhile, Hannah's life continued expanding in directions our parents had claimed were impossible. She'd been invited to serve on the state's Disability Rights Commission, her artwork was being acquired by major museums, and she was completing a master's degree in social work to enhance her advocacy credentials. "I want to become a licensed social worker so I can provide direct services to abuse survivors while continuing my speaking and artistic work," Hannah explained during one of our sister dinners. "My personal experience combined with professional training could help me support other survivors more effectively." The educational goals Hannah was pursuing represented everything our parents had insisted she'd never achieve. Not only was she pursuing graduate education, but she was doing it while maintaining a successful marriage, a thriving career, and advocacy work that was saving lives and changing policies. My own career in disability advocacy had flourished alongside Hannah's success. Working at the organization she'd helped establish, I was now supervising programs that protected vulnerable individuals from family abuse while supporting survivors in rebuilding their lives and accessing resources for independence. "Rebecca, your documentation of your sister's abuse and your courage in protecting her created the evidence base that made legislative changes possible," said our organization's director during my recent performance review. "Your work has directly contributed to protecting hundreds of disabled individuals from family violence." The most meaningful aspect of our shared work was understanding that Hannah's survival had created ripple effects that extended far beyond our personal family tragedy. Her case had exposed systematic problems in how society recognizes and responds to disability abuse, leading to changes that would protect future generations of vulnerable individuals. Every time I speak about my experience, someone approaches me afterward to share their own story of family abuse, or to ask for resources to help someone they suspect is being mistreated, Hannah told me during one of our conversations about the continuing impact of her advocacy. "My survival has become a catalyst for other people's healing and protection." The woman our parents had tried to eliminate as a burden had become a force for social change, whose work was protecting people across the country from experiencing the systematic abuse she'd survived. As I watched Hannah accept a National Advocacy Award during the conference's closing ceremony, I reflected on how completely our parents' attempt to destroy her had backfired. Their cruelty had revealed Hannah's extraordinary strength while exposing their own moral bankruptcy. This award belongs to every survivor who's found the courage to speak about abuse and every person who's chosen to protect vulnerable individuals rather than enabling their mistreatment, Hannah said during her acceptance speech. Survival isn't just about getting through trauma, it's about transforming pain into purpose and using personal experience to prevent others from suffering similar harm. The standing ovation that concluded the conference lasted nearly 10 minutes, with hundreds of people celebrating not just Hannah's achievements, but the systemic changes her survival had made possible. Have you ever witnessed family members treating a vulnerable person with cruelty disguised as concern? Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is document abuse and protect someone who can't protect themselves, even when confronting the truth destroys family relationships forever. What would you have done in my situation when I realized my parents were systematically abusing Hannah and planning her abandonment? Would you have trusted authorities to handle the situation, or would you have taken direct action like I did? I'm curious about your thoughts on family loyalty versus protecting vulnerable relatives from abuse. The hardest part of this experience wasn't the legal proceedings or the media attention, it was accepting that people I'd loved and trusted were capable of attempting murder disguised as tough love. But ultimately, exposing their abuse saved Hannah's life and created systemic changes that have protected countless other disabled individuals. If this story resonates with you, please hit that like button and share your own experiences with disability discrimination, family abuse, or standing up for vulnerable family members in the comments. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and protecting someone who couldn't protect themselves? Your stories help others who might be facing similar situations. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories about family abuse exposure, disability rights advocacy, and the courage required to protect vulnerable people from those who should be their greatest protectors. Ring that notification bell so you never miss updates about survival stories, justice served, and building meaningful lives despite family rejection. Please share this video with anyone who needs to hear that every person has inherent worth and dignity that can't be diminished by physical limitations or dependency on others for care. Abuse is never acceptable, regardless of family relationships or the victim's disability status. Thank you for listening to our story, and remember, real family protects and celebrates each other, especially when protection requires courage and love demands action. The people who view you as a burden don't deserve to benefit from your strength and survival. Until next time, keep believing that every life has value worth protecting, keep fighting for people who can't fight for themselves, and keep building relationships based on love rather than convenience. Sometimes the greatest revenge is refusing to be destroyed by people who underestimate your worth and potential.